Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We take on complex global issues and give you that essential knowledge shortcut. Today we are getting into a really jarring political collision. We're looking at the high-stakes world of global economic governance, specifically the G20, and how it met head-on with politically weaponized conspiracy theories.
It is a high-velocity event for sure. And the epicenter of all of this is South Africa. I mean, you have a nation trying to lead the world's major economies toward consensus on huge issues like climate and debt. That's the aspirational side of global politics.
Right.
And at the same time, a narrative built on, well, pure misinformation is being used as a wrecking ball against them.
And the consequences are far from abstract. Our sources lay out a pretty shocking timeline. So you have South Africa preparing for its 2025 G20 presidency, trying to drive the agenda for the Global South. But then, by 2026, we see these headlines detailing actions taken by former President Donald Trump. He bars South Africa from the 2026 G20 summit in Miami, and, maybe even more critically, he suspends all U.S. subsidies. That includes crucial health aid.
It's just an unprecedented use of political pressure, and it was all fueled by rhetoric that targeted South Africa's land reform policies. That whole policy shift really started back in 2018.
The investigation.
Yeah, the move by the U.S. to publicly tell the Secretary of State to investigate South African land and farm seizures and the large-scale killing of farmers.
So we have these two massive opposing forces. On one side, you've got the G20, driven by South Africa's 2025 theme of solidarity, equality, and sustainability, an attempt to bridge global economic gaps.
And on the other side, this dark counter-narrative, the exponential growth of the Great Replacement Theory, or white genocide, as it's also called. And it strategically seized on those claims about farm violence in South Africa to sort of validate its core extremist idea.
So our mission today is to understand how the G20 actually works, to trace the really insidious digital mechanism of this conspiracy theory, and most importantly, to analyze the tangible humanitarian costs of this collision in South Africa. Let's maybe start with the G20 itself. It's a term that gets tossed around a lot, but what is the true scope and scale of this institution that South Africa was suddenly leading?
The G20 is immense. I mean, it's 19 countries, plus the African Union and the European Union. But just think about the economic reach.
It's most of the world's economy.
It covers about 85% of the world's GDP, over 75% of world trade, and roughly two-thirds of the world's population. It's the main forum for international economic cooperation. It was set up in 2008, right after the Lehman Brothers collapse showed everyone that, the traditional institutions just weren't fast enough.
And it operates very differently from something like the UN, right? It breaks into these two operational tracks to actually get things done.
That's the key. First, you have the finance track. This is led by the real heavy hitters. Finance ministers, central bank presidents. They focus on the hard macroeconomic stuff, debt restructuring, financial stability. This is where the big money decisions get made.
But then you have the Sherpa track, which I think is fascinating politically. These are the personal representatives of the G20 leaders, highly trusted people.
They are, and they're essentially negotiating the entire political agenda. They oversee all the details through 15 different working groups. This is where you get into the weeds on women empowerment, health, energy transition, the digital economy. And South Africa's presidency used this Sherpa track perfectly to make sure the issues of the Global South were central to the whole thing.
So let's look at that 2025 agenda. Under those themes, solidarity, equality, sustainability, where do they actually move the needle, especially for African challenges?
Well, they focused heavily on closing the infrastructure and debt gaps. On debt and finance, they got these reaffirmations for strengthening debt sustainability. We saw real progress cited under the Common Framework. That's a multilateral process to help indebted nations.
Right, like for Chad and Zambia.
Exactly. The sources specifically mentioned debt treatments for Chad, Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia. This is crucial because, success here validates the G20's entire reason for being.
They also had to address the critical lack of power. The energy statistics are just staggering. They speak directly to the inequality South Africa was trying to fight.
They really are. Over 600 million people across the continent don't have electricity. That's an average access rate of only 40%. It's the lowest in the world. So the G20, under South Africa's leadership, pushed for global commitments to triple renewable energy capacity.
Triple it.
Globally, yeah, and double energy efficiency improvements by 2030. It's a huge generational investment that's required.
And then there was food security. We're talking about 720 million people going hungry in 2024. That's a crisis that undermines everything else.
It does. South Africa pushed for implementing what they called the Ubuntu approaches on food security and nutrition, which is a very intentional cultural choice. Ubuntu emphasizes shared humanity, community. So by adopting that language, the G20 was committing to supporting African-led strategies, like the African Union's CAADP strategy. It's about building resilient local food supplies.
Okay, and finally, there was the pillar of digital inclusion and ethical AI. That sounds ambitious. I mean, given the G20 is dominated by countries of the world's biggest tech companies, how realistic is it for South Africa to push for an ethical AI framework?
It's highly aspirational, you're right, but it's essential. South Africa was advocating for affordable, meaningful connectivity to address the gross inequality faced by millions, especially women, youth, and rural populations. The ethical AI framework wasn't so much about regulating Silicon Valley directly, but about making sure AI adoption in the global south doesn't just make existing divides even worse.
Okay, so on one side, you have this massive, formal, multilateral body trying to achieve collaboration and growth. Now, we have to pivot to the opposing force, this dark mechanism that leveraged these deep-seated anxieties to directly attack South Africa's legitimacy.
And this is where the information war gets pretty frightening. We move from the world of Sherpas and finance ministers to the world of white extinction anxiety. The Great Replacement theory is, at its heart, a political myth. The idea is that an organized, shadowy cabal of elites, often identified as Jewish or cultural Marxists, is intentionally undermining Western civilization through non-white immigration.
And what the sources show is that these conspiracy theories don't thrive because they have a better argument. They thrive through overwhelming dissemination. It's quantity over quality.
Precisely. They exploit basic cognitive biases, rumors. Dissemination is so cheap and easy in the digital age. You don't need a perfect argument, you just need a pervasive story that seems plausible to people who are already afraid.
I want to focus on that mechanism for spreading the message, the silent whistle. That concept is so chilling in how it lets a dangerous idea slide into the mainstream.
The silent whistle is, it's ingenious and insidious. It's a coded technique. It was initially used by early internet groups, like on 4chan, and then picked up by extreme right-wing organizations. They use what seem like innocuous terms or symbols to secretly signal support for white supremacism.
Like the OK symbol.
Exactly, the OK hand gesture. Early trolls realized it could be recontextualized to suggest white power. This let them spread hate in public spaces without immediate consequence. The message gets to the people who are in on it while looking harmless to everyone else.
It gives them so much plausible deniability. And these theories, they always need an omnipotent target, right? Some group that has almost superhuman powers to coordinate everything.
Absolutely. The theories function by excessively attributing control. Look at the example of George Soros in the discourse around the 2018 migrant caravans. He's made out to have these superhuman powers of global coordination. This is not a new trick. It's the same logic as the historical forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which claimed Jews secretly controlled all governments. The theories simplify chaos by pointing a finger.
And this is where South Africa becomes a perfect proxy. How did the theory take this global abstract anxiety and root it so specifically there?
Because South Africa offered a real-world flashpoint that could be dramatically distorted, the theory seized on these unsubstantiated claims of large-scale killing of farmers, the farm murders, and weaponized them. They were used as proof of an organized white genocide to demand global political intervention.
But when you actually look at the data, the whole narrative just falls apart.
The distortion is profound. South Africa has a massive generalized crime problem. It records around 27,000 murders a year. The killings of white farmers, while tragic, are less than 1% of that total. And it's important to know, the worst year for farm murders was 1998, with 153 deaths. The South African government dismissed the claims as false information and reaffirmed its commitment to land reform as a way to correct the historical dispossession from the 1913 Natives Land Act.
So the narrative is built on a tiny sliver of tragic truth violence in a high-crime country, but it's inflated into this racially motivated extinction plot, and then it's successfully mainstreamed.
And that strategic mainstreaming is the real danger. The core idea is embraced by far-right terrorists. Breivik, Tarrant, Crucius all mentioned it in their manifestos. But it's the jump into paleo-conservative media and public figures, like Tucker Carlson and white nationalist leaders like Nick Fuentes, that truly embeds the theory into political discourse, makes it palatable enough to influence high-level policy.
Which brings us to the policy fallout. The collision between the G20's ideals and the power of this conspiracy resulted in the suspension of critical aid. This is where the damage becomes tangible and deadly.
It's the humanitarian crisis that follows the political maneuver. The U.S. decision in 2025 to suspend aid, closing U.S. aid and stopping PEPFAR grants, was done under the guise of realignment with national interests. But the consequence for South Africa was immediate and devastating.
Let's focus on that PEPFAR crisis. What is PEPFAR and why is its abrupt withdrawal so critical for South Africa?
PEPFAR is the U.S. president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. It's one of the most successful global health programs in history, and South Africa has the largest HIV-positive community in the world. 8 million people. That's 13% of the population. In 2024 alone, South Africa got $453 million in PEPFAR funding. And that money isn't just for pills. It funds the entire infrastructure of testing, distribution, prevention, everything.
And the numbers quantifying the impact of this withdrawal are just brutal. It's not a budget cut. It's an immediate reversal of decades of public health success.
Exactly. Leading scientists have published estimates showing that without effective transition plans, which are impossible to implement overnight, this could lead to an estimated 601,000 HIV-related deaths and 565,000 new infections in South Africa over the next decade. You're dismantling a massive, life-saving health system based on a politically motivated story.
And that kind of decline, it doesn't just stop at South Africa's borders, does it?
No. That's why we use the analogy. If South Africa sneezes, the whole region catches a cold. Why? Because 83.5% of immigrants living in South Africa are from the surrounding SADC region. Their economies are all tied together. Aid withdrawal and the economic decline that follows in South Africa, it risks tearing apart the social contracts in neighboring countries. It creates regional instability.
So what we've really analyzed today reveals this profound tension at the heart of modern global politics. On one hand, you have the collaborative, consensus-driven structure of the G20, striving for a world of economic expansion. On the other, you have a powerful, weaponized political narrative creating tangible, deadly consequences based on pure fabrication.
It really highlights the extreme fragility of high-level global governance. A huge, consensus-driven agenda focused on complex things like energy transition and debt. It can be instantly undermined by a cheap, emotive narrative that targets one vulnerability. In this case, the highly charged issues of land and race in South Africa.
So what does this collision force us to consider about political conflict itself, regardless of our own viewpoint? The sources drew a powerful comparison between radical groups on the ground in South Africa. You have white nationalists like the Swedelanders preparing for civil war, and then you have black radicals like Andile Mngxitama who wants white people to be subdued.
Right, and despite being on completely opposite sides, both groups share a critical assumption about the world. They both see power and resources, especially land, as a finite, divisible resource to be fought over. It's a zero-sum game, which is the exact opposite of the fundamental premise of the G20 and globalization.
Which is perpetual growth.
The premise of perpetual growth, of unlimited resources, solving all conflicts by just making the pie bigger for everyone.
And that contrast, I think, is the ultimate provocative thought from this deep dive. What happens to your own political assumptions, no matter what they are, whether you favor global collaboration or isolation, when the premise of endless growth and resources is suddenly taken away?
The South African context forces that confrontation directly. When the resource is finite, the conflict immediately shifts from debating policy papers to fighting over who gets control of the actual thing. And that knowledge, born from this collision of high governance and domestic extremism, is something you can now analyze through a whole new lens.
That's it for this deep dive. Thank you for joining us.